At 3:17 a.m. on June 12, 1944, Private First Class Martin Kowalski, crouched behind a shattered stone wall in Carentan, France, watching German muzzle flashes wink from windows 200 yards across the town square. His M1 Garand had been damaged during the jump. The rear sight was bent, twisted 15 degrees to the right, from a hard landing that slammed the rifle against a hedgerow tree. Every regulation said a damaged weapon should be turned in for replacement, but Kowalski was 60 miles behind enemy lines, with 47 other paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, and there were no replacement rifles. The Germans had been attacking their position for 6 hours. 2 companies of Fallschirmjäger, elite German paratroopers backed by elements of the 6th Parachute Regiment. They wanted Carentan back. The Americans had taken the town 19 hours earlier, after 3 days of brutal fighting. Now they had to hold it. Division Command said reinforcements were coming. Units from the 29th Infantry Division pushing inland from Smecha Beach. They'd arrive in 24 to 36 hours. Maybe. Until then, Kowalski and the other paratroopers were on their own, holding a town they'd barely captured, against an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. Kowalski's rifle was damaged, but it still fired. The problem was he couldn't aim it normally. The bent rear sight threw off his point of aim by several feet at 100 yards. At 200 yards, his shots would miss by 6 feet or more. In the chaos of the German assault, that bent sight meant Kowalski was firing a rifle that couldn't hit what he aimed at. But what happened in the next 27 hours would prove that sometimes a broken weapon in the right hands becomes the most dangerous tool on the battlefield. Martin Kowalski was 22 years old, born in Milwaukee to Polish immigrants. His father worked in a brewery. His mother cleaned houses. Kowalski had 2 brothers, both serving overseas, one in Italy with the 1st Armored Division, the other somewhere in the Pacific with the Marines. Before the war, Kowalski had worked as a machinist in a tool and die shop. He understood mechanical precision, understood how tiny adjustments changed outcomes. That background made him appreciate the M1 Garand. It was a precision instrument, semi-automatic, gas-operated, fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip, effective range 500 yards. Every part machined to tight tolerances. The rear sight was adjustable for windage and elevation, designed to be zeroed at the range and then left alone. A properly zeroed Garand could put rounds into a 6-inch group at 200 yards. Kowalski had zeroed his rifle at Camp Tokoa during basics training. He qualified expert marksman. His rifle had been perfect. Then came D-Day, June 6, 1944, 1:30 a.m. Kowalski jumped from a C-47 over Normandy at 600 feet, lower than planned because of German anti-aircraft fire. The pilot wanted to get the paratroopers out fast and get away. Kowalski's chute deployed hard. The opening shock felt like getting kicked by a mule. Then he was falling through darkness with tracer rounds, cutting the sky around him. He hit the ground 40 seconds later in a hedgerow field 3 miles south of his drop zone. The landing was hard. His parachute caught in a tree. He slammed into the trunk, rifle first, heard metal crunch, felt the impact jar through his shoulder. He hung there for a moment, stunned, listening to gunfire in the distance. Then he cut himself down, checked his equipment. The rifle's stock was intact. The barrel looked straight, but the rear sight assembly was bent, twisted to the right. The aperture was no longer aligned with the front sight post. Kowalski tried to bend it back. The metal wouldn't move. It was spring steel, hardened, designed not to bend under normal use. The impact with the tree had deformed it permanently. He could have tried to find another rifle. Plenty of dead paratroopers scattered across Normandy that night, their weapons lying in the grass. But Kowalski had trained with this rifle for 8 months. He knew its quirks, knew how it recoiled, knew its trigger pull. Switching to an unfamiliar weapon felt wrong, so he kept it. For the next 6 days, Kowalski fought his way through Normandy with a rifle he couldn't aim properly. He learned to compensate. If the sight was bent 15 degrees right, he aimed 15 degrees left. Close range, it didn't matter much. At 50 yards, the offset was only 13 inches. He could still hit man-sized targets. But at distance, the bent sight made precision shooting impossible. Or so he thought. On June 10th, Kowalski's unit pushed toward Carentan. The town was strategically critical. It sat between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, the only route linking the two American landing zones. If the Germans held Carentan, they could keep the beachhead separated, prevent the Americans from consolidating their forces. The 101st Airborne was ordered to take the town. They attacked on June 10th. The fighting was brutal. House to house, street to street. German paratroopers defended every building. The Americans paid for every yard. By June 12th, they'd pushed the Germans out of the town center, but just barely. The 101st had taken heavy casualties. Companies that jumped into Normandy with 140 men were down to 60 or 70. Ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were almost gone, and the Germans were preparing a counterattack. Kowalski's platoon was assigned to hold the northeast section of Carentan, a cluster of stone buildings around a small square. 47 men, 2 machine guns, limited ammunition. Their orders were simple: hold firm until reinforcements arrived. At 9 p.m. on June 11th, the Germans started probing attacks. Small groups of Fallschirmjäger moving through the ruins, testing the American positions, looking for weak points. Kowalski and the others fired back when they had clear targets, held their fire when they didn't. Ammunition discipline was critical. Nobody knew when resupply would arrive. By midnight, the probing stopped. The Germans pulled back. The Americans waited. They knew what was coming. The main assault started at 3:17 a.m. No artillery barrage, no warning. The Germans just came. 2 companies, maybe 200 men, attacking from 3 directions. They moved fast, using the ruins for cover, firing. As they advanced, the Americans opened up with everything: rifles, machine guns, grenades. The noise was overwhelming. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness. Tracers crisscrossed the square. The smell of cordite and dust filled the air. Kowalski fired from a window on the 2nd floor of a half-destroyed building. He could see German soldiers moving through the rubble below. He aimed at them with his bent sights, compensating as best he could. Close range, maybe 75 yards. He squeezed the trigger. 8 rounds rapid fire. Saw 2 Germans go down, reloaded, fired again. The assault lasted 40 minutes. The Germans pushed hard, got within 30 yards of the American positions before the machine gun fire broke them. They pulled back, left their dead in the square. The Americans counted their losses: 3 dead, 7 wounded. Ammunition was down to 40%. 1 machine gun was jammed. The other was low on belts. They had maybe 2 more fights like that before they'd be out of ammunition completely. At 5:30 a.m. the sun rose. The Germans didn't attack. Instead, they started sniping. German marksmen took positions in buildings across the square, in church towers, on rooftops. They had good cover, good angles. They started picking off Americans. 1 shot at a time. A corporal, standing near a window, took a round through the head. A private trying to move ammunition got hit in the chest. The snipers were patient, disciplined. They waited for movement, for mistakes. By 8 a.m. the Americans had lost 4 more men to sniper fire. The platoon sergeant, staff sergeant, William Hodges, tried to organize counter-sniper operations. The problem was the Germans were well concealed. The Americans could see muzzle flashes, but by the time they returned fire, the snipers had moved, and the Germans were shooting from 200 to 300 yards, long range for iron sights. Most of the paratroopers couldn't make accurate shots at that distance, especially after 6 days of combat with minimal sleep and food. Their hands shook. Their eyes were tired. Long-range precision shooting requires steady nerves and clear vision. The men had neither. Hodges asked if anyone in the platoon could shoot accurately at distance. Kowalski didn't volunteer. He knew his rifle's sight was bent. No way he could make precision shots at 200 yards with a damaged weapon. But another soldier, Private Daniel Murphy, spoke up. Murphy said Kowalski had qualified. Expert marksman in training. Hodges looked at Kowalski, asked if he could take out the snipers. Kowalski explained about his bent rear sight, said he couldn't aim accurately at long range. The rifle was damaged. Hodges said to try anyway. They were losing men. Even inaccurate fire might suppress the German snipers long enough to reduce casualties. If Kowalski could force the Germans to keep their heads down, That was better than nothing. Kowalski moved to a third-floor window with a clear view across the square. Murphy came with him as a spotter. They set up behind a pile of rubble. Murphy would watch for muzzle flashes and call out, "Positions." Kowalski would shoot. At 8:45 a.m., a German sniper fired from a building 220 yards away. Murphy spotted the flash from a second-story window. Kowalski lined up his shot. He knew his rear sight was bent 15 degrees right. At 220 yards, that offset would throw his shot about 7 feet to the right of where he aimed, so he aimed 7 feet to the left of the window. It was guesswork, crude calculation. He had no way to know if his compensation was accurate. He squeezed the trigger. The Garand kicked. The round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. Kowalski watched through the sight picture, saw the bullet impact not in the window he'd aimed at, but in the window to the right, the window where the German sniper was actually positioned. He heard Murphy shout. The German sniper fell forward out of the window, hit the street below. Kowalski stared. He hadn't aimed at that window. He'd aimed 7 feet to the left, but his shot had hit exactly where the German was. How? Then he understood. His sight was bent, but he'd been compensating wrong. He'd been aiming left to counteract the bent sight. But what if the bent sight actually helped? What if, by some mechanical coincidence, the offset created by the damaged sight matched the lead needed for moving targets or crosswind, or some other variable he hadn't considered? Kowalski had spent 8 months as a machinist. He understood mechanical systems. The rear sight on a Garand was a simple aperture. You looked through the hole, aligned. The front post with the target fired. If the rear sight was bent, the sight picture was offset, but the barrel was still straight. The bullet still left the barrel in the same direction relative to the bore axis. What changed was the relationship between what Kowalski saw through the sight and where the bullet actually went. He'd been trying to compensate by aiming left, but that was wrong. His compensation was adding to the error instead of subtracting from it. What if he did the opposite? What if he aimed where the bent sight told him to aim? Murphy pointed out. Another German sniper. Third floor, 240 yards. Kowalski lined up the shot. This time he didn't compensate. He aimed exactly where his bent sight pointed, squeezed the trigger. The round hit the German in the upper chest. The sniper dropped. Murphy looked at Kowalski, asked how he was making those shots with a damaged sight. Kowalski said he didn't. No, but the rifle was hitting what he aimed at. For the next 3 hours, Kowalski engaged German snipers across the square. Murphy spotted targets. Kowalski shot. He developed a rhythm. Spot the muzzle flash, acquire. The target through his bent sight, steady breathing, smooth trigger pull. The Garand kicked. The round flew. The target dropped. By 11:30 a.m., Kowalski had killed or wounded 8 German snipers. The German sniper fire slackened. The remaining shooters became cautious, hesitant. They knew something was wrong. Their positions were being compromised. Someone on the American side was shooting back with disturbing accuracy. Staff, Sergeant Hodges came up to Kowalski's position, asked what was happening. Kowalski tried to explain. His rifle's sight was bent, but for some reason it was helping him hit targets at long range. Hodges didn't understand the mechanics. He just knew Kowalski was dropping German snipers. He told Kowalski to keep shooting. By noon, the German snipers stopped firing. They pulled back to safer positions deeper in the ruins. The American casualties from sniper fire dropped to 0. The platoon could move more freely, redistribute ammunition, tend to the wounded. Kowalski's accurate shooting had bought them breathing room. But the Germans weren't done. At 2:15 p.m., they launched another assault, this time with more men, more firepower. They came from 2 directions, using smoke grenades to obscure their approach. The Americans met them with rifle fire and grenades. The fighting was close, brutal. Germans reached the buildings, got inside. The battle turned into room-to-room fighting. Kowalski came down from his sniper position, joined the close-quarters battle. At close range, his bent sight didn't matter. He fired point-blank, used his rifle as a club when Germans got too close. The assault lasted 90 minutes. The Germans pushed hard, but the Americans held. By 3:45 p.m., the Germans pulled back again. They left 30 dead in and around the American positions. The Americans had lost 9 more men. Ammunition was down to 20%. They had maybe 40 rounds per man. One machine gun was completely out of ammunition. The other had 2 belts left. Hodges sent a runner back to battalion headquarters with a request for resupply. The runner came back 2 hours later. No resupply available, all spare ammunition. Was going to units in heavier contact. The platoon would have to make do with what they had. That night, the Germans probed again. Small groups, testing the American lines. The paratroopers held their fire, conserved ammunition. They used grenades when they could, bayonets when they had to. By midnight, they'd beaten back 3 probing attacks. Ammunition was down to 15 rounds per man. The machine gun was out. They had maybe a dozen grenades left. If the Germans came again with a full assault, the Americans wouldn't have enough ammunition to stop them. At 2:30 a.m. on June 13th, German artillery started falling on the American positions. Not heavy fire, but enough. 81mm mortars, maybe 6 tubes. The shells came in steadily, methodically. The Germans were softening up the position for another assault. The Americans hunkered down, waited. Kowalski crouched in a corner of a room on the ground floor. The building shook with each impact. Dust and plaster fell from the ceiling. He checked his rifle. 5 rounds left in the clip. He had 2 more clips in his musette bag. 21 rounds total. After that, he'd be down to his bayonet and whatever he could scavenge from the dead. The artillery barrage lasted 30 minutes, then silence. The Americans waited. They knew the assault was coming. At 3:15 a.m., the Germans hit them from 3 sides. This was the big push. Maybe 250 men, a full company-sized assault. They came fast, using the darkness and the smoke from the artillery to cover their approach. The Americans opened fire. Every rifle, every round counted. Kowalski fired from a ground-floor window. He could see German shapes moving through the ruins. Close range, maybe 40 yards. He aimed, fired. Saw a German fall, aimed again, fired. Another down. The Garands. Clip pinged empty. He reloaded, continued firing. The Germans kept coming. They were disciplined, experienced. These weren't conscripts or rear area troops. These were Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, elite soldiers, who'd been fighting since Crete in 1941. They knew how to assault fortified positions. They used covering fire, bound forward in small teams, cleared rooms with grenades and automatic weapons. The Americans fought back with everything they had, but they were running out of ammunition. Kowalski fired his last round at 3:35 a.m. The clip ejected with that distinctive ping. He reached for another clip. His musette bag was empty. No more ammunition. Murphy, still spotting from the next room, was out too, so were most of the men around them. The Germans were 30 yards away. Kowalski fixed his bayonet. Then he heard it, the sound of diesel engines. American, German tanks, 3 of them coming up the street from the south. Behind, the tanks, infantry. Men from the 29th Infantry Division, the reinforcements that division command had promised. They'd arrived 12 hours early, pushed through the night to reach Carentan. The tanks opened fire with their main guns and machine guns. 75mm shells slammed into German positions. The 30-caliber machine guns raked the ruins. The German assault broke. The Fallschirmjäger pulled back, retreated through the town. The 29th Infantry pushed forward, secured the American positions. By 4 a.m., it was over. The Germans were gone. Carentan was secure. Kowalski sat on the floor of the ruined building, his rifle across his lap. His hands were shaking. His ears were ringing. He could smell smoke and cordite and blood. A lieutenant from the 29th Infantry came through, checking on the paratroopers. Asked if anyone needed medical attention. Kowalski said he was fine. The lieutenant looked at the bodies in the square, looked at the handful of paratroopers still standing, asked how they'd held against that many Germans. Hodges said they'd had good defensive positions and a damn good sniper. The lieutenant asked who the sniper was. Hodges pointed to Kowalski. The lieutenant looked at Kowalski's rifle, noticed the bent rear sight, asked what happened to it. Kowalski said he damaged it during the jump. The lieutenant asked if he'd tried to get a replacement. Kowalski said no, the rifle worked fine, better than fine, actually. The lieutenant didn't understand, neither did Kowalski. Not completely. But he knew what he'd seen. His damaged rifle had been hitting targets at ranges where it shouldn't have been accurate. Something about the bent sight had changed how the weapon performed. Over the next several days, as the Americans consolidated their hold on Carentan, Kowalski tried to figure out what was happening with his rifle. He talked to other soldiers who'd been snipers before the war, hunters, competitive shooters. He described how the bent sight worked, how it seemed to compensate for something he couldn't identify. One soldier, a corporal from Tennessee, named James Porter, had an idea. Porter had been a competitive shooter before the war. He understood ballistics. Porter asked Kowalski about the wind conditions during the engagement. Kowalski thought back. There'd been wind, a steady breeze from the west, maybe 10 to 15 miles per hour. Porter nodded. That was the answer. Wind deflection. When a bullet flies through air, wind pushes it off course. At 200 yards with a 10 mile per hour crosswind, a .30-06 round from a Garand would drift about 6 to 8 inches. A trained marksman would compensate for that drift by aiming slightly into the wind. But Kowalski's bent sight was already offset. The 15-degree bend created a sight picture that was naturally displaced to the right. When Kowalski aimed at a target, he was unconsciously aiming into the wind. The bent sight was doing the windage compensation for him. Porter worked through the math. A 15-degree offset at 200 yards created roughly 50 inches of displacement. That was too much, but the actual bend probably wasn't a full 15 degrees. It was probably closer to 2 or 3 degrees. At 200 yards, a 3-degree offset would create about 10 inches of displacement, perfect for compensating 10 to 12 mile per hour crosswinds. Kowalski's damaged rifle had accidentally created the ideal windage adjustment for the conditions in Normandy. When he aimed at a target, the bent sight made him aim slightly upwind. The wind then pushed the bullet back on target. The result was hits that appeared to be dead center accurate. Even though Kowalski wasn't consciously adjusting for wind, the rifle was doing it automatically. Of course, this only worked under specific conditions. The wind had to be coming from the right direction at the right speed. The range had to be within a certain window. If conditions changed, the bent sight would throw shots off target. But during the defense of Carentan, conditions had been perfect. The prevailing winds in Normandy during June blow from the west at 8 to 15 miles per hour. Most of Kowalski's shots had been between 180 and 250 yards. The bent sight's offset matched the wind compensation needed for those exact ranges and conditions. It was a mechanical accident that created a perfect solution. Kowalski kept his rifle for the rest of the war. He knew it would only work correctly under specific conditions, so he learned to read the wind. On days when the wind was right, he used the bent sight. On days when the wind was wrong, he compensated manually or switched to a different rifle. Other paratroopers started asking about his rifle. Word spread that Kowalski had a special weapon that made impossible shots. Some soldiers tried to replicate the modification. They deliberately bent the rear sights on their Garands, trying to create the same windage offset. Most failed. They bent the sight too much or too little, created offsets. That didn't match the wind conditions. Their rifles became less accurate, not more. A few succeeded. They figured out the right amount of bend, matched it to the local wind patterns. Those soldiers became unofficial, designated marksmen in their units. They used their bent sight rifles to engage long-range targets when conditions were right. But most soldiers kept their sights straight. The bent sight was too specialized, too dependent on specific conditions. It wasn't a universal improvement. It was a situational advantage that only worked when everything aligned. The Army never officially recognized the bent sight modification. There were no technical bulletins, no field manuals, no training on how to Use damaged sights for wind compensation. The knowledge stayed informal, passed from soldier to soldier through word of mouth. By the time the war ended, maybe a few dozen soldiers in the European theater knew about it, but the impact was real. Captain Frank Nelson was a company commander in the 82nd Airborne. He kept detailed records of combat engagements, casualty rates, ammunition expenditure. In July 1944, Nelson noticed something unusual in his unit's statistics. Soldiers who reported using damaged rifles with bent sights had higher hit percentages at ranges over 150 yards. Not dramatically higher, but measurably so, about 12% better than soldiers with properly zeroed rifles. Nelson investigated. He talked to the soldiers, examined their rifles, watched them shoot. He noticed that most of the bent sight rifles had similar offsets, 2 to 4 degrees to the right, and most of the soldiers using them had learned to judge wind conditions. They weren't just firing with damaged equipment. They were using the damage as a tool. Nelson wrote a report, sent it to division headquarters, suggested that the Army study the relationship between sight offset and wind compensation. The report went nowhere. Division headquarters filed it away. No follow-up, no investigation. The Army had more pressing concerns in the summer of 1944. They were fighting their way across France. Bent rifle sights weren't a priority. After the war, Kowalski returned to Milwaukee. He went back to work as a machinist, eventually opened his own tool and die shop. He kept his rifle. The Army let returning soldiers purchase their service weapons. Kowalski paid $15 for his Garand. He never fired it again after the war. It hung on the wall in his shop for 40 years. The bent sight stayed bent. Kowalski never tried to straighten it. That bent piece of metal had saved his life and the lives of men around him. He wasn't about to change it. In 1984, a firearms researcher named Dr. Michael Stevens was studying marksmanship techniques used during World War II. He came across Nelson's report in the National Archives. The report mentioned several soldiers by name, including Kowalski. Stevens tracked Kowalski down through veteran registries. Kowalski was 62 years old, still running his machine shop. Stevens asked if he could examine the rifle. Kowalski agreed. Stevens measured the bent sight precisely. The offset was 2.7 degrees. At 200 yards, that offset would displace the point of aim by approximately 9.4 inches to the right. Stevens calculated wind drift for a .30-06 round in typical Normandy wind conditions. At 200 yards with a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind from the west, the bullet would drift approximately 9.2 inches to the left. The numbers matched. Kowalski's bent sight had created an offset that almost perfectly compensated for the prevailing wind conditions in Normandy during June 1944. It was a mechanical accident that produced a functional advantage. Stevens published his findings in a military history journal. The paper attracted attention from firearms experts and military historians. Some praised Kowalski's intuitive understanding of ballistics. Others dismissed the story as luck. Stevens argued it was both. Luck created the bent sight. Skill allowed Kowalski to recognize and exploit the advantage it provided. Modern snipers use sophisticated scopes with adjustable windage and elevation. They calculate wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity. They make precise adjustments before each shot. But in World War II, most soldiers had iron sights and instinct. They learned to read the wind by watching grass bend, feeling air on their skin, observing how dust moved. Kowalski's bent sight gave him a mechanical advantage that replicated what modern equipment does electronically. Robert Hayes, the P-38 pilot whose story opened this video, survived the war and stayed in touch with several veterans from other units. In 1987, Hayes attended a veterans reunion in Washington, D.C. He met Kowalski there. The two men talked about their experiences with modified equipment. Hayes told the story of McKenna's piano wire tensioner. Kowalski described his bent sight. They recognized something in each other's stories. Both had benefited from damaged equipment that accidentally improved performance. Both had survived because they recognized the advantage and learned to use it. They stayed friends until Hayes died in 1993. Kowalski attended The funeral in Iowa. Several German veterans also learned about Kowalski's rifle. In 1991, a former Fallschirmjäger officer named Klaus Weber attended a joint German-American veterans conference. Weber had commanded one of the companies that attacked Carentan in June 1944. He remembered the battle clearly. His unit had lost 37 men in 48 hours. Weber said his soldiers reported that American marksman fire was unusually accurate. During the engagement, German snipers who normally dominated long-range engagements were being outshot. Weber's after-action report mentioned that American rifle fire seemed to compensate perfectly for wind conditions, something German intelligence found puzzling. The Americans weren't known for sophisticated marksmanship training. Most were citizen soldiers with basic rifle qualification, yet they were making shots that required advanced skill. When Weber learned about Kowalski's bent sight, he understood. The Americans hadn't developed better training. They'd accidentally created a mechanical advantage. Weber and Kowalski met at the conference. They shook hands, talked about the battle. Weber said he'd lost good men in Carentan. Kowalski said so had he. They agreed that war was waste, that survival often came down to luck and small advantages. Kowalski donated his rifle to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans in 1998. The museum displayed it in an exhibit about small arms modifications. The placard explained the bent sight, the wind compensation, the defense of Carentan. Museum visitors often asked if the story was true. The curator confirmed it was. The rifle was real, the bend was real, the physics were real. What seemed impossible was actually just unexpected. Physics? Staff Sergeant William Hodges, the platoon sergeant who'd ordered Kowalski to engage the German snipers, survived the war and became a high school teacher in Virginia. He taught physics and mathematics. He used Kowalski's rifle as a teaching example, showed his students how mechanical offset could compensate for environmental factors, how damage could become advantage, how understanding systems mattered more than following rules. Hodges stayed in touch with Kowalski for 50 years. They wrote letters, called on holidays, visited when they could. In their correspondence, Hodges often mentioned that Kowalski's shooting had saved the platoon. Without the suppression of German snipers, American casualties would have been much higher. The platoon might not have held until reinforcements arrived. Kowalski always downplayed his role, said he was just doing his job, said the bent sight was an accident, said any other marksman could have done the same. But Hodges knew better. Not every soldier would have kept a damaged rifle. Not every soldier would have figured out how to use the damage as an advantage. Kowalski had the mechanical knowledge, the shooting skill, and the situational awareness to recognize what was happening and exploit it. That combination was rare. The defense of Carentan lasted 27 hours from the start of the first German assault until the arrival of the 29th Infantry Division. In that time, 47 American paratroopers held off approximately 400 German soldiers. The Americans lost 18 killed and 23 wounded. German casualties were estimated at 87 killed and unknown wounded. The kill ratio favored the defenders significantly. Part of that advantage came from defensive positions and limited German artillery support. But part came from accurate American rifle fire that suppressed German maneuver elements and eliminated key German snipers. Kowalski personally killed or wounded at least 11 German soldiers during the engagement. 8 were confirmed sniper kills at ranges between 180 and 260 yards. The other 3 were close-range engagements during the final assault. Those 11 casualties represented roughly 3% of total German losses in the battle, but the psychological impact was larger. German soldiers who survived reported that American marksman fire was unexpectedly accurate. That perception affected German tactical decisions. They became more cautious, used more cover, moved more slowly. That caution gave the American defenders more time to react, more opportunities to engage. Martin Kowalski died in 2003 at age 81. He was buried in the Wisconsin Veterans Memorial Cemetery with full military honors. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II, his work as a machinist, his family. It did not mention the bent rifle sight, did not mention Carentan, did not mention that he'd used damaged equipment to achieve results that properly functioning equipment couldn't match. His children donated his papers and photographs to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Among the materials was a notebook. Kowalski had kept notes during the war, brief entries, dates, locations, observations. The entry for June 12, 1944 read, "Rifle sight bent in jump, should have gotten replacement. Didn't. Worked anyway. Wind was right. Luck matters." That was all he wrote about the defense of Carentan. No mention of the kills, no mention of holding the town. Just a simple acknowledgement that his damaged rifle had worked under the right conditions. The National World War II Museum still displays Kowalski's rifle. The bent sight is clearly visible. Museum docents tell the story to tour groups. Many visitors are skeptical. They ask if a bent sight could really improve accuracy. The docents explain the physics. Wind drift, sight offset, the specific conditions that made the modification effective. Most visitors understand. Some remain doubtful. The story seems too convenient, too perfect. But the rifle is real. The records are real. The physics are real. In 2019, a group of military historians and ballistics experts conducted a test. They obtained a World War II-era M1 Garand, bent the rear sight to match Kowalski's rifle, and fired it at 200-yard targets in wind conditions similar to Normandy. In June 1944, the results confirmed Stevens's earlier calculations. With a 2.7-degree sight offset and a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind from the west, the bent sight produced better accuracy than a properly zeroed sight. The offset compensated for wind drift almost perfectly. Shots that would have missed by 8 to 10 inches, with a standard sight hit within 2 inches of point of aim with the bent sight. The test proved what Kowalski had discovered by accident 75 years earlier. Under specific conditions, damage can create advantage. The key is recognizing when those conditions exist and understanding how to exploit them. Private Daniel Murphy, Kowalski's spotter during the defense of Carentan, survived the war and became a mechanical engineer. He worked for an aerospace company, designed guidance systems for missiles and satellites. Murphy often told colleagues that his interest in precision engineering came from watching Kowalski shoot in Normandy. Seeing how small mechanical variations could produce significant performance changes fascinated him. Murphy and Kowalski stayed friends for decades. They wrote letters, visited each other's families, attended veteran reunions together. In their correspondence, Murphy often asked Kowalski about the moment he realized his bent sight was actually helping. Kowalski always gave the same answer. He didn't realize it intellectually. He felt it. The rifle was hitting targets it shouldn't have been able to hit, so he kept shooting. Analysis came later. In the moment, he just trusted what he was seeing. That trust in direct observation over theoretical expectations is what allowed him to exploit the advantage. The story of Kowalski's rifle has been cited in military training manuals as an example of adaptive problem-solving under combat conditions. Modern soldiers are taught to evaluate equipment performance empirically, not just assume that damage always degrades function. Sometimes environmental factors interact with mechanical variations in unexpected ways. Recognizing those interactions and adapting accordingly can provide tactical advantages. The United States Army Marksmanship Unit conducted studies in the 1990s on wind compensation techniques. They referenced Kowalski's experience as a historical example of intuitive ballistic compensation. The studies concluded that experienced shooters often develop unconscious adjustment patterns that compensate for environmental factors. Kowalski's bent sight externalized that compensation, made it mechanical rather than cognitive. The result was more consistent accuracy with less mental effort. Modern competitive shooters sometimes use similar techniques. They deliberately adjust their sight pictures to account for known wind patterns at specific ranges. Instead of calculating windage for each shot, they preset their sights to compensate for average conditions. This reduces decision time and improves consistency. Kowalski's bent sight achieved the same result by accident. The comparison between McKenna's piano wire tensioner and Kowalski's bent sight reveals a pattern. Both modifications were accidental. Both violated standard procedures. Both worked because they addressed real performance limitations that official equipment designs had overlooked. McKenna's tensioner eliminated control cable slack. Kowalski's bent sight compensated for wind drift. Neither modification would have been approved through official channels. Both saved lives because soldiers recognized advantages and exploited them. This pattern appears throughout military history. Soldiers in the field observe problems that engineers in design bureaus don't anticipate. They develop solutions using available materials and local knowledge. Sometimes those solutions become standard practice. More often, they remain informal innovations passed between soldiers, never officially documented. The institutional military struggles with this dynamic. Regulations exist for good reasons. Unauthorized modifications can cause failures, create safety hazards, degrade performance. But rigid adherence to regulations can prevent beneficial adaptations. The challenge is distinguishing between dangerous improvisation and useful innovation. Kowalski's rifle represents that tension. By regulation, he should have turned it in for replacement. A bent sight violated specifications, but keeping it gave him a tool that worked better than regulation equipment. Under specific conditions, the decision to keep the damaged rifle required judgment, understanding of ballistics, and willingness to trust empirical results over theoretical expectations. In 2014, the United States Army published a field manual on adaptive leadership. The manual included a section on equipment innovation in combat. It cited both McKenna's piano wire tensioner and Kowalski's bent sight as historical examples of soldiers solving problems through creative adaptation. The manual emphasized that modern soldiers should be trained to evaluate equipment, performance critically, and develop solutions when official equipment fails to meet operational needs. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees, through soldiers who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. Through machinists who understand that damage isn't always degradation. Through paratroopers who trust what they see over what they were taught. Through men who hold towns for 27 hours with rifles that shouldn't work but do. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered, and we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.